Matt Wixey is a senior threat researcher and a PhD candidate at the UCL Dawes Center for Future Crime. He previously worked as a penetration tester and threat intelligence analyst. He also led cybersecurity research and development capabilities for both a large professional services firm and law enforcement department. His research is focused on the physical and psychological effects of cyberweapons. He has presented at numerous security conferences, including Black Hat USA, Black Hat Europe, DEF CON, and the ISF Annual Congress, and more. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt. Thank you again for being here this morning, and looking forward to have a discussion with you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to Human Side Channel Cyberweapons and Cyber Defenses. So my name is Matt Wixey. I'm a senior threat researcher at a security firm, although I should emphasize I'm doing this talk in a personal capacity. As Matt mentioned, I'm also a PhD candidate at the University College London Dawes Center for Future Crime, currently on a break from that. And I've worked in security for about 12 years. So I did several years as a pen tester, several years as a threat intelligence analyst, and some time as a research and development lead as well. Before that, I worked in law enforcement here in the UK. So my PhD and a lot of this talk is going to focus on whether or not a cyber weapon is a true weapon. So the consensus in the literature is no, it isn't, that computers don't really have an inherent capacity to cause harm. And that if they are used in the context of weapons, it's more likely to be used in the sense of disruption, distraction, or potentially as a force amplifier. And a lot of the literature out there kind of regards this discussion of cyber weapons as quite hyperbolic and exaggerated. You know, that we've all seen kind of the newspaper headlines about digital Pearl Harbors and cyber 9/11s and that kind of thing. So that's kind of disparaged quite a lot in the literature. And the general sense is that if harm is caused as a result of a cyber attack, it's likely to be an indirect consequence. So if there's an attack against the national grid or against a water treatment plant or something, there may be blackouts or problems with water supplies and that kind of thing. And then you might get kind of riots or people suffering harm as a result. So generally, it's thought of in that context of critical infrastructure. So as a result, cyber weapons are thought of more as a tool of espionage or sabotage, possibly even as a more ethical means of waging war because they're thought to have less capacity for violence and bloodshed. And if you look at some of the legal and just general definitions of the word weapon, there's a lot of debate as to whether cyber weapons even fit into that because they're abstract, not physical, because they're not intended to cause harm or damage, and because they're not deployed to cause harm either. So the question that everyone then asks is, what about Stuxnet? So Stuxnet was probably the first, at least the first prominent example of malware crossing the digital divide between abstract to physical. Although it was designed for sabotage and did have effects, it was also incredibly expensive. So it would have cost potentially millions of dollars in R&D. Arguably had little practical impact. Obviously, it generated a lot of discussion, but the actual effects it had are questionable and may even have been counterproductive in that after the attack, the victim probably beefed up their security quite a lot. Stuxnet also relied on specific vulnerabilities. So once those vulnerabilities are patched or otherwise mitigated, then the cyber weapon itself becomes useless. And as a lot of researchers have pointed out, it is really technically complex to attack critical infrastructure like that. It requires a lot of expertise, not something that the average person is going to be able to do. More recently, there's been a bit of a shift in focus looking at the feasibility of potentially lethal attacks aimed at specific technologies and devices. And a lot of that is due to the growth of Internet of Things and embedded devices, so things like medical implants, vehicles, manufacturing systems, and so on, as well as research into more psychological or cognitive harm, so things like gaslighting and disinformation, purely within the cyber world, so things like fake social media accounts and disinformation campaigns and that kind of thing. These tend to be a lot less expensive and a lot less complex, but harm is still an indirect consequence. So we're generally talking about kind of a computer attacking another computer and then human harm being an indirect consequence of that act. So some examples of this kind of thinking: as far back as 2008, the Conficker worm affected physical hospital equipment and therefore may have had kind of knock-on effects on patients. Similarly, WannaCry, at least here in the UK in 2017, did affect hospital waiting times and patient waiting times, which again could have had a knock-on effect. Various researchers have looked at vulnerabilities in certain kinds of medical implants, so insulin pumps and pacemakers. Balasek and Miller in 2015 looked at vulnerabilities in a particular kind of SUV, which allowed them to remotely control the vehicle, so making it speed up, making it crash, that kind of thing. Oluwafemi and others in 2013 looked at a particular brand of IoT bulb and were able to make it explode, thereby potentially causing fires. And Rios and Butts in 2017 managed to compromise, of all things, an internet-connected car wash, and were able to make that car wash strike people, human users. So again, whilst there's kind of perhaps more scope for these being considered as cyber weapons, it's still an indirect consequence. My research focuses on whether or not computers do actually contain an inherent capacity to cause harm, specifically because of the fact that they produce outputs, which can then become human inputs. Specifically, light, sound, heat, and language are the main things I'm looking at. And if those can be weaponized in some way, then effective cyber weapons may be possible. They're not necessarily technically complex because they're looking at human vulnerabilities. And for the same reason, they're not necessarily one-shot things like Stuxnet because they're not exploiting vulnerabilities that can be patched per se. An example of this is some attacks against epilepsy sufferers in 2008 and 2019, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So what we're not talking about is something like this, which is a typical understated tabloid headline, but more stuff like this. So in 2008, I think as yet unknown threat actors posted GIFs and links to pages with GIFs on an epilepsy foundation's website. Those GIFs were flashing images which were designed to flash at the frequency associated with photosensitive epileptic seizures, causing several epilepsy sufferers to have severe migraines and almost to have seizures. In 2019, threat actors did the same thing to a specific individual on Twitter. They tagged them in tweets which contained flashing images, again designed to flash at that particular frequency. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking at as to whether more attacks like this might be possible and how to counter them, how to mitigate them. So I'm going to talk about one empirical example of this that I did back in 2018, 2019. I won't be able to go into every single detail because it's quite a complex investigation, but I'll kind of cover the basics. So this was looking at the feasibility of acoustic cyber weapons. So whether through malware or other attacks, it's possible to force a computer device to emit sound that is both imperceptible to the user, but simultaneously damaging to them. So I guess the first thing to mention when it comes to acoustic weapons is there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about them, and I'll cover some of those a bit later. It's also a really common delusion. People think they're being persecuted by acoustic weapons. But the main fact is that whilst acoustic weapons, certainly in the sense of them being completely covert, is probably more of a myth than reality. The fact is that really any sound above a certain level can cause physical and psychological damage. As you can see from this graphic here, when you're talking about sort of 115, 120 decibels, the level of exposure you have to that sound before physical damage starts occurring is kind of less than 30 seconds. That's whether you are aware of it, whether it's kind of consciously perceived or not. So it really doesn't matter kind of what frequency it's at. One thing to note when it comes to discussion of decibels is that decibels are not an absolute measure, they're a relative measure. So it depends on how close you are to the thing that's transmitting the sound and also kind of how long you're exposed to it and stuff as well. So I'll give you a bit of background on exactly what it was we were looking at, and then I'll talk more about the experiment and what we actually did. So this was focusing on two particular categories of frequency, ultrasound and infrasound. Ultrasound is sound that's above the theoretical human hearing threshold, and infrasound is below that threshold. Traditionally, the range of human hearing is described as between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. That's the kind of accepted threshold. It's really a misconception because those thresholds vary widely, as we'll see. I'm in my mid-30s. I can hear about 15 kilohertz just. I can't hear anything above that. When I was kind of 18 or 19, I could hear up to 22. So it does decrease with age. With this talk, I'm going to use the abbreviations HFN or high frequency noise, which refers to 17 to 21 kilohertz, and low frequency noise or LFN, 60 to 100 hertz. Now, 17 kilohertz, young people would be able to hear that. And at the top end of the LFN, 100 hertz, people probably would be able to hear that. To the extent, to what extent depends on you as an individual, really. You also might perceive some of those lower frequency sounds more as vibration than anything else. So let's talk about imperceptibility. So if you were looking to create an acoustic weapon, either with ultrasound or infrasound, one of the key things is that the intended victim shouldn't be able to hear those sounds. But the problem with imperceptibility is that, as Duck and Layton point out, basing a definition on a lack of a property is really problematic. There aren't arbitrary cutoff points. It's not a set threshold. The mechanisms of perception of sound are not fully understood. And there is a really significant variation in thresholds as well. And whether or not you perceive a sound depends on a lot of things. It's not just the frequency itself. It depends on the volume of that sound, the background noise, the previous exposure you've had to similar frequencies and that kind of thing as well. You also, as I say, may perceive sound as vibration. You also might hear audible subharmonics, which are kind of unintended components of a particular frequency. The likelihood of hearing particularly high frequency sounds declines non-linearly with age. So again, that's something that is a variable in this. That being said, there are, or in the literature, a lot of reports of people suffering adverse physiological and psychological effects when it comes to both high frequency and low frequency noise. So with high frequency noise, physiologically, the susceptibility differs. There's no reports of hearing loss, but there have been reports of adverse effects on hearing, temporary threshold shifts, which is where you are temporarily unable to hear sounds above or below a certain threshold, a reduction in hearing sensitivity in the audible range, and then neurasthenia, cardiac neurosis, hypertension, bradycardia, and functional changes in the cardiovascular and central nervous systems as well. There are some caveats attached to these, which I'll cover shortly. Psychologically, with high frequency noise, nausea, fatigue, and headaches have been reported, tinnitus and ear pain, irritation, somnolence, dizziness, palpitations, and decreased concentration. With low frequency noise, physiologically, temporary threshold shifts, again, some correlation with heart ailments, chronic insomnia, and elevated stress levels. And then psychologically, annoyance, headaches, deterioration in performance and productivity, lower levels of cooperation, and depressive symptoms and distress, even at quite moderate levels. So even as low as kind of 40 to 45 decibels. You'll notice with that one, 40, 45 decibels, I've put the letter A. I won't kind of go into the nuances of decibel weighting, but sufficient to know it's not just decibels. There are kind of levels of weighting that you apply to decibel measures depending on what frequencies they are, which either underemphasize or overemphasize the sound. So I mentioned there are caveats to these. So the data is often very sparse and anecdotal and easily misinterpreted. There's not always a detailed knowledge of the noise dose. So by that, we mean that the volume of the sound and the length of exposure to the sound. A lot of the effects have not been reproducible in lab environments. Obviously, there are ethical restrictions in exposing humans to potentially harmful levels of sound, and there's also possible nocebo effects as well. But there is a significant evidence base for adverse effects in at least a subset of the population. So what we kind of wanted to explore, our research question was, given that HFN and LFN may be imperceptible to a subset of the population and above certain levels may cause adverse effects in a subset of the population, and given that certain consumer equipment, including laptops, mobile phones and speakers, are capable of emitting HFN and LFN, we wanted to discover whether or not an attacker could develop malware or cyber attacks to cause a device to emit those frequencies at levels at or exceeding those in maximum permissible guidelines. And there's also a caveat attached to that, which I'll come on to, and therefore potentially cause adverse effects. So before we go any further, I just want to talk about some misconceptions around acoustic weapons. So I normally get asked these kind of after the talk, so I thought I'd cover them now. So one of them is the brown note. The brown note is an apocryphal frequency, a low frequency, which is said to cause people who hear it to lose control of their bowels, hence the name. There's no evidence that the brown note exists. Probably any low frequency sound, if it was played high, loud enough, would potentially have adverse effects on your body, and one of those might be losing control of your bowels, but there's no kind of magical frequency that does that. Paranormal experiences is a really interesting one, so it's a really interesting subtopic in acoustics. There's some evidence, or some researchers have found evidence, that infrasound specifically can cause people who hear it to experience feelings of dread and fear, that it may be associated with auditory hallucinations at particular frequencies. And so some researchers have argued that in particular locations where people have reported paranormal experiences, there may actually be resonant infrasonic frequencies which have caused those. So there's actually nothing paranormal about it. Other researchers have disputed it, but it's a really interesting field. And then the last one is Havana syndrome, so the US Embassy in Cuba, which was originally thought to be an acoustic attack. I haven't really been keeping up to date with that, but I understand that the latest working theory is that it might be due to microwave radiation. Whilst there were ultrasonic readings found near the site, I think eventually they were attributed to like the mating calls of crickets in the area or something like that. So it's certainly not something that could have caused the symptoms reported. And then acoustic weapons in general, there are a lot of misunderstandings around them when it comes to actually deploying them or using them or even creating them, there are really significant practical issues that you'd have to overcome. So things like threshold shifts, for example, are probably not of interest to the majority of attackers, as well as the fact that the effects are not predictable and affect different people in different ways. It's also really challenging to cause targeted directional effects, depending on what kind of noise you're using. So with low frequency noise, it's really good for propagation. It can travel very long distances, really, really hard to make it directional. There are size restrictions. So if you needed to build a speaker to emit low frequency noise at sufficient levels, you're talking about a huge speaker. With high frequency noise, it's low propagation, it bounces off stuff, which is why it's used for echolocation and that kind of thing. But it has good directionality, so you can kind of aim it at something. So all of these are kind of objections to acoustic weapons. That being said, there are applications of acoustic weapons in certain limited circumstances that are out there on the market. So there are things like the LRAD, the long-range acoustic device, which is used as a form of non-lethal crowd control. So it's quite directional, and it basically kind of projects a beam of sound at a targeted area, although they tend to be audible frequencies, I think. So our experimental outline, we wanted to develop attacks and malware which can control the volume and speaker output in certain consumer devices, play or stream frequency tones at a set of high and low frequencies, measure the output with the sound level meter, and compare the output to maximum permissible levels. I put an asterisk there because, as I mentioned earlier, there is another caveat around maximum permissible levels, which is just that there's loads of them. So a number of researchers and agencies have come up with maximum permissible levels, particular frequencies for high frequencies and low frequencies. So we just took a mean average of the maximum permissible guidelines in a compendium. But yeah, there's no real kind of argument for one over the other. So some scenarios we were looking at, or theoretical scenarios. So an attacker seeking to affect the performance of employees or staff, either individually or across an entire organization. So if you imagine an attacker's got control of an entire domain, they might want to put acoustic malware onto all of the laptops in that organization and therefore try and impact the productivity or general well-being of all the staff in that organization. Targeted harassment campaigns against individuals, and then low-grade cyber weapons. So these were the devices that we tested: a laptop, a mobile phone, a Bluetooth speaker, a smart speaker, a set of smart headphones, a vehicle public address system, a parametric speaker which uses an ultrasonic carrier wave to deliver an audio signal at lower frequencies, and a vibration speaker, which is different from a traditional speaker in that it doesn't have a coil, I think. So as you can see, these were all kind of fairly low cost devices. The highest one was $1,000 with the laptop. And the attack vector for these differed. So with the laptop and the phone, it was custom malware that we created and put onto those devices. With the Bluetooth speaker and the vibration speaker, there was a Bluetooth channel. For the smart speaker, there was a known CVE, a known vulnerability in that smart speaker, which we exploited. For the vehicle public address system, that's a USB operated device. So you plug in a USB stick into it, and it will play whatever sound files are on that USB. And then for the headphones and the parametric speaker, they're peripheral devices. So there are a number of attack vectors that could be used to exploit those. This was the measurement environment we used. So this is an anechoic chamber at University College London. I don't know if anybody on the call has been in an anechoic chamber before. If you haven't, I would recommend giving it a go. It's a pretty unnerving experience, to be honest. So it's a soundproof room, but it is the most soundproof that a room can get. It is the quietest place in the world, essentially. So these baffles on the wall are made of fiberglass, and they essentially remove all echo from the room. So acoustically speaking, it's an infinite space. So when you're in these and the door is shut, you can hear the sound of your heart beating. You can hear every rumble and gurgle from your body. If you turn your head, you can hear little bubbles of gas popping in your joints and that kind of thing. And really creepily, people have experienced auditory hallucinations in these. So the tech who kind of sorted it out for me to be here said that he's had to let people out. They've been kind of hammering on the door because our brains are so used to ambient noise, at least the theory goes, that when you completely remove that ambient noise, the brain kind of makes up stuff to substitute for it. So yeah, pretty unnerving, but yeah, worth an experience anyway. So we use this for our measurement environment. For, as I mentioned, for the Windows and Android devices, we create proof of concept malware. For the smart speaker, proof of concept exploit script. And the basic function of it was a remote command and control mechanism to get the current speaker volume and store it as an integer, raise the volume to 100, play a sine tone at a given frequency for a given duration, then stop playing the tone, lower the volume to the previous level, all whilst being measured by a sound level meter. So these are the results. So we tested 3 frequencies, 17, 19, and 21 kilohertz for HFN. The results in bold here are where the decibel level exceeded the mean average of the maximum permissible guidelines. So you can see that the smart speaker exceeded it at 17 kilohertz, the headphones exceeded it at 17 kilohertz, and so did the parametric speaker. The parametric speaker also exceeded it at 21 kilohertz. We also did a test at 40 kilohertz just for the parametric speaker. The reason for that is that the parametric speaker is designed to be an ultrasonic device, so it does emit 40 kilohertz waves. So there are three devices potentially which could be used or could be exploited to create low-cost acoustic cyber weapons: the smart speaker, the headphones, and the parametric speaker. Really, the smart speaker and the headphones would be kind of the only ones that would affect more people, just because they're more popular commercial devices. Although 86, 87 decibels is not particularly high, you'd have to be exposed to that for quite a long time, so several hours before it would start having an effect. The smart speaker, there's a big caveat around that as well, which I'll come to, which was actually something we found which was pretty cool but completely unintended. The headphones possibly are more realistic, just because there is evidence to suggest that more and more people are using headphones, and that people do use them at volumes higher than they should be. Interestingly, with the parametric speaker, you'll notice it was 117 decibels at 40 kilohertz, which is incredibly high and actually quite a safety risk. And that device does come with a safety warning for that reason. So that potentially, that cost us $250 to buy. So that potentially could be used by attackers as a low-cost portable acoustic weapon, particularly as it's very directional. You can essentially point it at someone. So that's a little bit concerning. And then on the low frequency noise side, the Bluetooth speaker and the smart speaker and the headphones were all capable of delivering results exceeding the mean average of maximum permissible guidelines at least one frequency. And the smart speaker was able to do it at all three of the ones we tested. Again, I know these do look lower, but the threshold generally is lower for lower frequency noise. So the smart speaker in particular was able to do it at three frequencies. So I want to talk about the smart speaker because that was a really interesting one. If I go back to this table, you'll see that the smart speaker produced 86 decibels over 10 minutes at 17 kilohertz, but then dropped massively at 19 kilohertz and didn't really recover with 21 kilohertz either. And the vehicle public address system had the same effect. So 75.3 at 17 kilohertz and then right down to 20. Now, when we tested both of those at 17 kilohertz and opened the anechoic chamber after 10 minutes, there was a really strong smell of burning plastic. And when we picked the devices up, they were really hot. What we subsequently found was that playing 17 kilohertz tones on the smart speaker and the vehicle PA system had essentially caused internal components of the speaker to melt. So this is a time graph for the smart speaker. So you can see after 2 minutes, there was some incident of damage, which caused a general drop off in volume levels. After about 5 minutes, there was a critical event and the sound level dropped off dramatically, to about kind of 20 decibels and didn't really recover after that. So we bought another smart speaker of the same make and model, and we wanted to see if this was kind of a consistent finding. So we played a piece of music, just a piece of pop music on the smart speaker, and made a spectrogram of this recording. And this is a normal frequency response. So you can see that frequencies between, kind of sub 1 kHz up to 20 kilohertz were produced. And that's a normal frequency response for a commercial speaker because, again, that's the threshold of human hearing. We then did the experiment, played the 17 kilohertz tone for 10 minutes, and then played exactly the same piece of music using the same speaker. And this was the frequency response. So no frequencies above kind of 1, 2 kilohertz. So we've essentially degraded the speaker to the point where it no longer really functions as a speaker properly, which was an interesting denial of service attack that we hadn't really considered. So yes, that was one finding. We reported that to the manufacturer and they've now fixed it. So in summary, a minority of the devices that we looked at potentially could be used as low-cost cyber weapons. And obviously there are a number of other devices which potentially could be used in that fashion. But there are a lot of caveats associated with doing this. So the first is audible components. So this is a test, I think, for the headphones. So you can see there's a big spike at around about 16, 17 kilohertz, which is the intended result. But there are also a lot of audible components between 125 hertz and 12.5 kilohertz. They're not massive. They're up to about kind of 25 decibels. But you would notice that probably as, kind of buzzing or interference or something like that, something which would make you think, oh, there might be something wrong with my headphones. So that limits the covertness of this attack. There's also the fact, obviously, that you're reliant on several things. You're reliant on the victim not perceiving the sound. You're relying on them being susceptible to adverse effects of the sound. And you're reliant on them being exposed to the sound for a sufficient amount of time for harm to be caused. There's also a practical question in that if an attacker has access to a network or a laptop or a phone or whatever, that they may well or are much more likely to be interested in other avenues of attack rather than this. So this really only applies to a very small minority of attackers. In terms of countermeasures, there are a number of countermeasures that could be applied to limit this attack. Limiting the frequency range of commercial devices, so you don't need to go up kind of above 17, 18 kilohertz. Alert users when speakers are in use, which I think some mobile operating systems do already. Filter out audio files to remove frequencies above and below a certain threshold. Heuristic detection for antivirus. So, for example, it's really rare that a normal application would need to access, store, or change the volume levels, system volume levels. And so that's one thing that could be used for heuristic detection. Environmental monitoring, which depending on what country you're in is a normal health and safety measure anyway, is monitoring the kind of ambient environment for sounds above a certain level. And then on a policy level, as I mentioned, just the sheer number of maximum permissible guidelines makes kind of analysis quite difficult to do. So ideally, there'd be some sort of consensus around there. And this doesn't just apply to this attack. The work of Timothy Layton and other people has demonstrated that even just walking around in public, we are exposed sometimes to quite high levels of ultrasound as a result of things like pest control devices and advertising beacons and those things you put on lampposts to repel teenagers, that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's definitely kind of a wider public health issue there as well. So I think Matt sent around some links on the email, which I think has both of these on there anyway. But our paper is available on archive. It was also presented at IEEE Safe Things in 2020. And then there's a YouTube link for the DEF CON talk. So I'll move on to defenses. So if we stick with this kind of paradigm of it not just being computer against computer, but looking at the human interaction, then some really interesting avenues of investigation and possibly defense open up as well. And it's all based around this principle of a human interacting with the machine will leave certain traces. So one of the first things that forensic scientists are taught is that every contact leaves a trace. And that applies not just to physical forensics, but to digital forensics as well. And specifically what I'm looking at is personality theory. So personality theory is essentially boiled down to its essence. Every action or reaction that you take will have a distinctiveness and yet a consistency to it, because everyone has a different upbringing and experiences and education and training and that kind of thing. And once you've kind of found a way that you like to do things, you tend to stick with it. And that can potentially be quite useful for attribution. Now, attribution is a really hard problem in cybercrime, in cybersecurity. I've worked as a threat intelligence analyst. I've worked in law enforcement. It is a really hard thing to do. There are discrete identifiers that people tend to rely on. So IP addresses, MAC addresses, email addresses, domain names, that kind of thing. But they're also really, really easy to obfuscate, spoof, and anonymize. There are alternative methods, but they tend to take us further away from the individual, which is what I'm trying to focus on. So some of those methods include things like time zones. So if you're looking at a malware campaign, for example, one of the things you might look at is what hours the attacker is active on a particular system for. You would then try and correlate those hours to working hours in a particular time zone or a particular country. And that might enable you to say that this attacker is potentially based in this time zone or potentially based in this country. That's going on the assumption that the attacker does working business hours, which has its own set of implications, which I won't go into here. And then there are TTPs, so how attackers do what they do. So you can say something like, this threat actor has used this particular backdoor, and then they've used this method of privilege escalation, and then they've used this method of exfiltration. And those are all TTPs that we link with this threat actor group. So we can say that this threat actor is tentatively linked to this group or whatever. Again, it takes you further away from the individual. I'm not saying it's not useful, but yeah, it's not really kind of the focus of my research. Which is looking at side channels. So the kind of unintentional leakage of certain behaviors, as I said, based on education, experience, training, environment, and goals, that kind of thing. And the theory goes that these behaviors and their traces can potentially be used against attackers to try and track them or try and link them to other attacks. So I'll talk about 3 ways in which that could be done. I am kind of glossing over these quite quickly, and there's each of these could be a separate talk in itself. The first is forensic linguistics. So this is something that I have kind of dabbled in at various points. Forensic linguistics it has a number of sub-disciplines to it. I'm just going to focus on one, which is authorship attribution via something called stylometry, which is an analysis of someone's writing style. And this theory goes that everyone has a distinctive yet consistent style of writing. So particularly with regards to things like syntax and sentence structure, grammatical structure, choice of vocabulary, spelling mistakes, that kind of thing. It has been used as legal evidence in certain countries. The kind of threshold varies between different countries. Some countries it's not accepted as legal evidence or court evidence, but it has been used as well in law enforcement for things like ransom notes and suicide notes and murder investigations. It's also been used in industry for things like plagiarism detection and for unmasking pseudonymous authors and that kind of thing. So there has been some research on applying this to cybercrime, and specifically things like forum posts and social media posts, which could potentially be of interest. So you're looking at things like ransom notes, manifestos, negotiation conversations with ransomware actors, that kind of thing, where you might take one of those posts and compare it against a corpus of threat actors to see if you can kind of identify who those threat actors might be. There's also a really interesting sub-branch of that called code stylometry, which is a researcher called Khaliskan Islam has done a lot of really interesting stuff on this. So this looks at code. So it looks at malware code. Well, not necessarily malware code, but any kind of code, really. So forensic linguistics, like applied to source code, is pretty easy because there are a lot of variables and a lot of attributes that you can use with source code. However, when code is compiled, a lot of those artifacts are no longer recoverable in that executable or in that compiled version. But Khaliskan Islam and colleagues have looked at ways in which stylometry can be applied to compiled code, which is really, really interesting because you can take a piece of malware that has been compiled and say, this has a lot of similarity in its, in the style of its functions and how it operates compared to this malware sample, which wasn't previously thought to be related. So it's possible with this degree of predictive accuracy that these two malware samples were written by the same person, which is really interesting. If you are interested in giving forensic linguistics a go, there are various free tools, JGAP, Delta spreadsheets, and the Stylo library for R, some that I've played around with before and found really useful. There are also machine learning models as well for forensic linguistics. There are caveats and countermeasures and countermeasures with forensic linguistics. I mean, a big caveat is it's not a silver bullet. It's not, it is imprecise because we're talking about humans and human behaviors. And various ways that it can be combated include being aware that you have a linguistic style and deliberately trying to disguise it, deliberately imitating other writers, which can frustrate forensic linguistics. And people have also run text through various intermediary tools, so things like translation tools, ChatGPT, Anonymouth as well, which I don't know is actually still maintained, but that was a tool that was developed specifically in response to forensic linguistics to try and frustrate it. But yeah, worth a look if you're interested. And then number 2 is behaviors. So this is an experiment I did back in 2016. It feels like a long time ago now. And this was part of my master's degree at UCL. So this was based on something called case linkage analysis, or CLA, it's been applied to real world offences before. It's essentially you take granular behaviors from a crime that's been committed. So say it's a burglary, you will look at the tool used to gain entry to the building, exactly how entry was achieved, what property was taken, what time of day was the offence committed, that kind of thing. And then you would compare those behaviors statistically to other burglary offences using a similarity coefficient and logistic regression. The idea being that you can then link together disparate offences to a common offender. So this hadn't been applied to cybercrime before. So this is what I did. So I set 2 vulnerable virtual machines and invited a sample of people to attack both of them, one after the other, and basically I gave them low privileged access, and I asked them to try and escalate the privileges, exfiltrate data, generally just kind of poke around and enumerate and that kind of thing. And I was recording all of their keystrokes. I then took granular behaviors from pairs of those offences to try and determine the degree of similarity. So there are 3 behavioural domains I looked at: navigation, enumeration, and exploitation. Turn them into dichotomous variables. To give you an example, these were Linux machines we were talking about. So on Linux machines, you use the ls command to list out the contents of a directory. But there are lots of switches that you can use with the ls command, which will subtly alter the output. So there's an A switch, an L switch, an H switch, and so on. And the order that you put those in is kind of arbitrary, really. It's just personal preference. There might be a really, really subtle difference, but generally it's pretty arbitrary. But people tend to stick to the same way of doing things. So it was kind of the level of granularity that we were looking at, which was actually kind of a lot more granular than real world offences. Then applied a similarity coefficient called Jacquard's coefficient, which gives you a score for each pair between 0 and 1, 0 being perfectly dissimilar and 1 being identical. Put those coefficients into a logistic regression model, then into a forward stepwise logistic regression model, then ROC curves. These are the AUC, so area under the curve results for these ROC curves. So a ROC curve, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of mapping like true positive to false positive and true negative to false negative to see how accurate your model is. So with the three behavioral domains, navigation, enumeration, exploitation, you see we've got pretty good results here. So 0.99 with navigation, which was the best one, then exploitation at 0.96, and then enumeration at 0.91, all of them being statistically significant. I also looked at three other domains. So one was looking at the interval between keystrokes as to whether that could be a measure that could be used for attribution. Another was the interval between commands, and then there was a number of backspaces like as a percentage or key presses. So keystroke and command interval actually weren't that useful, so only slightly better than chance. There are a few reasons why that might be. One of them is network latency, which makes it quite difficult to actually analyze those correctly. Backspace is a bit more promising, so maybe that's worthy of some further research, is the number of mistakes, and there are probably kind of other things you could do to look at number of mistakes. Backspace is quite a crude measure, but yeah, for me the main focus was on those top three. Again, there are some caveats with this. So some offenders are a lot more distinctive than others. Some behaviors are a lot less consistent. Offenders do develop and evolve, and that's probably particularly the case with cybercrime. And also offenders do change their behaviors in response to events. So with real world crime, that's kind of, if the victim fights back or something like that. But with cybercrime, it might be if there's a particular form of EDR on the system, or they are discovered or something like that, then they may well change their behaviors, which then may impact attribution attempts using this method. And then there's also kind of the validity of the study. So this was a really small scale study. It was looking at one scenario. There was kind of a ground truth there. These weren't real world attackers, while they were kind of experts to some degree. They're all pen testers and hackers and that kind of thing. They weren't kind of real world threat actors. So that's, again, something to think about. And then the last one I want to cover really briefly is looking at deception. So this is based on a talk I gave in 2018 at Black Hat. And this is looking at potentially how to try and spot people lying online. So humans are actually really bad at detecting lies. We think we're pretty good at it, and we know that we lie to each other all the time, but we're not actually that good at knowing when people are lying to us. Even police officers, who you think would be really good at spotting it, actually aren't much better than the average person. They just tend to think people are lying more than they actually are, because the job has made them cynical and bitter. Attackers, threat actors will lie for many reasons. Social engineering is a big one, so things like phishing, catfishing, so longer term social engineering campaigns, that kind of thing. And negotiations with ransomware, that sort of stuff. Also false flags and false attribution. So a really nice example of that is Gucci for 2.0. That was a really interesting case, which also had some crossover with the forensic linguistics, where this threat actor was pretending to be a native speaker of one language, when in fact they were actually a native speaker of another language. And they were doing that deliberately to try and kind of frustrate an analysis and investigation. So the research suggests there are certain linguistic markers that could be really useful in detecting deception computationally. So things like liars using more words, being more informal, avoiding kind of sensory descriptions, avoiding causal terms, increasing negation, using more negative emotion words, asking more questions, and using more I words and pronouns. There are some caveats again to this. So as researchers pointed out, there's no Pinocchio's nose. There's no kind of silver bullet again. Deception can also change with the stakes, and lies do become better the more they do, the more they lie. That being said, lying is a cognitively stressful activity. It involves psychological and physiological arousal, because you're trying to do several things at once. You're trying to avoid detection, suppress the truth, convince someone that you're telling the truth, and then also keep a story straight as well. Actively as well as passively, there are maybe things we can do really interesting around this. So we can try and increase the cognitive load on lies, which might make them make mistakes. So some examples of things that could be done in this area include trying to move lies to more synchronous environments where it's much harder to keep track of lies. So I'm thinking, things like instant messaging or video chat or voice chat or something like that, as opposed to something like email, where you've got a lot of time to get your story straight. Requesting more sensory information and asking more questions, emphasizing underemphasized elements, and introducing additional tasks as well. But yeah, I appreciate I haven't gone into that into a lot of detail, but hopefully it sparks some inspiration in someone who might want to look at it further. If you're interested, these are links to talks I've given on those subjects in more detail in the past, so do feel free to check those out. And I think, that is me. So thank you very much. I hope that's been useful and or interesting. And thank you again for listening.